They'll blanket you in Wi-Fi and profit off the radiation. Congregation collecting the people for that Satan. I keeps it blazing, cause I can read between the lines. I ain't blind, we unwind what they're really saying. Genetically modify what you're tasting. Loan you that cottage promise, so now you live up in your mom's basement. Redesign time so your mind is always wasted. Programmed to crave the basics. Keep the beta in stasis. Pay the state, kid. You're in debt for being born. Messengers are more than just the price for being warned. Don't be alarmed, disconnect from their machinations. Stop subscribing to the folly of own nations. Bone breaking ain't the answer, cause they seek the ownership of souls. Spread the seeds and watch them grow. Break the chains of control. Break the chains of control.
Sweet, eternal balance of all that is good, true, and beautiful. Friends, it is always an honor and a pleasure to host the man who understands logic and rational thought so deeply and has such a commitment to unearthing every secret and leaving no stone unturned that he could draw together literally every single mystery in the history of mankind into one epic tome of knowledge and wisdom, laying smack dab centered in biblical scripture as factual record keeping and the word of God. And trust me, even if that's not where you stand currently, this is exceptionally well worth your time to hear out and see to the end, because this dedicated man will show you exactly what all the mystery schools and hidden histories have purchased for you in the end times, which we are fast approaching as always. And Gary Wayne, author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, it's my immense honor to have you back again tonight on Rogue Ways. Thank you for always giving us so much of your time and expertise.
Well, thank you for inviting me back, and very much looking forward to talking more about all of those wonderful things that you just listed there that hopefully I can live up to and not disappoint people.
I don't know how you could. Like, this book, I always point out to people, it's like as big as the Bible itself. It's so amazing. And every single chapter, I say this every time too, I think we could do an episode on every single chapter, because every single chapter is like its own Da Vinci Code almost, you know, with this like unveiling of all of these things that people usually don't know everything about.
Well, that's why I wrote it the way I did, because it's such a long book, right? So I wanted to figure out a way that I could keep people interested and that they didn't feel like they had to read it all at the same time. So every chapter is a mini story that leads into the next chapter and will sort of keep coming up as the book unfolds. So you can go back, go forward, come back and reread and leave it anytime that you want, and then just pick it up again.
That's absolutely true. I think I read it over the course of like maybe a year, or it took me a while, but it was exactly like that. I could just pick it up any day and read that chapter and be like, oh my God, it's so mind blowing. And I always tell everyone, like, they should get it and do exactly that. Just like read even random chapters at a time. You know, it's just such a great book. So I have just the weirdest smattering of questions to ask you, which are just based on, you know, since the last time we talked, I just keep a list of things that come up, and so that's where these questions are all coming from. But I do always like to ask a pointless question on the episode, and I wanted to ask you, Gary, if you and your family play board games, and if so, why, and if not, why?
Not often, but there's one game that we play at the lake because we have some friends that like it, called Aggravation, when it's with marbles. But typically, if we're going to play a game, it's a card game.
Oh.
And there's some really good card games out there. One that we like that's not probably all that familiar with people outside of the prairie provinces in Canada, but it's a game called Kaiser. And it's played with 32 cards, and it's a very fast moving, and you have to count the cards and you have to know what's going on, and the bidding's really kind of wild and crazy. So it's you know, I know bridge, and I've played a lot of bridge, is sort of the gold standard, but it doesn't have the same sort of action that this game has, and it really sort of gets you hooked on it because of how fast it moves.
That's the kind of game I'd have to play, you know, like 40 times before I could even start to understand what was going on or something. Anything?
Well, if you can play whist, you can sort of build on it, but you've got these crazy things in there, like, and I don't want to spend too much on the card game, but you've got like a -3 card, so it's a trick -3 at a +5 card, and there's only 8 tricks.
I'm already lost.
So it centers around 10. So like I say, you really got to keep an eye on what's going on and know the power suits and know what you have to be focused on, or you'll get set every time. So
Sounds like a fun game. I keep hearing about really good card games too, so it's interesting. I wonder if part of this whole, whatever you want to call this that's going on, the alleged pandemic is, bringing back some of these types of like nice pastimes that I think we used to have more of and then lost.
Hopefully it is.
Yeah.
When I was growing up, I loved to play Stock Ticker and I loved to play Monopoly and, board games like that, Remoli. And you could kill, or another game as I got a little bit older into the teens, we used to play Risk, and sometimes we might play that for 2 days. So it's a wonderful way to be with friends and family and talk and do things that was kind of being lost in the age of gadgets and screens and things like that. So if there's something that can sort of move that back a little bit in time and bring a little bit more balance, I think that's quite healthy, because we're social beings, right? So we need to socialize.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, that's one of the things that I love, just while we're on the topic of every once in a while going to church. I don't go to church as much as, other people who might. But I love when I do, because there's just people who are there who are happy and who are joined together in like a common purpose. And we don't have that very often in our society. We don't have it enough, really. But that's another version of that, right? Like, we need these things. And that was one of the things that surprised me. And I wonder what you think about this with this whole, shutting down of everything. I was very surprised that churches went along with it, because I just would have expected a more of a like, no, this is our religion, so you can't stop us. But it's not what we saw.
To me, it demonstrates the weakness in church leadership today, that they are more part of the system than they are about looking after their people. And so I think this won't be as easily done going forward, because people are not going to accept that as readily as sort of the novelty of what kind of happened this time. But you can't take away people's rights. And one of the things that, I like to talk to people about when they're foolish enough to ask me, just talking with people in the neighborhood and stuff like that, is that the one thing the governments never do, and they're all this way, in some way worse than others, but there hasn't been one government that I'm aware of that has sat down with all of the stakeholders of every type of group. So you have the government, you have the health, you have, let's say, customers, you have the people that are running it, and sort of within the church organization group, parishioners, ministers, priests, government, health, and say, how do we do this portion of society in a safe way? And get everybody on the same page. Nobody gets the stakeholders together by group. They just use this blunt instrument right across the board. Might as well be a sledgehammer. And then they pick favorites on who they're not going to slam down. But there's no science, and they call it science, but all it is junk science and political science. But there's no real science. And a science of convenience for your political power that they're exercising, which makes it, to me, more closer to political science than anything else. True. But nobody has done this. I mean, it just makes sense. We could have had society open in safe ways that would have been so much better, and instead of suffering through what is going to be extraordinary consequences of mental health going forward. Lost years for education, the permanent imprint that has happened on the youth that sets their character for the rest of their lives. And I won't go through every sort of detail and bore everybody with it, but the concept is that it was done in a way that it seems brutal and intentional, as opposed to nuanced, surgical, which would be more scientific, and in a way that would allow society not to completely shut down. And I think was a grand experiment as to what they could get away with and what they will want to do for changes going forward, because they want to be more aggressive and control people than less. And there's going to be more pandemics, there's going to be more catastrophes, and this was a very good test run for them. I think they've failed miserably. I think they've lost too many people, which means they've got to get better at it. But now people hopefully are going to be more aware. So that's once we pass through this gate, then they're going to say, okay, we got through this gate, but you're not doing this anymore.
I hope you're right. I know a lot of people have sort of quote unquote woke up because of, how fast and quick and hard these, government smackdowns were. But I also feel like a lot of people just rolled over even faster and just laid down and, let it happen. And I don't know. I don't really know. It's hard to gauge like who's doing what, because I know that the views presented to us, even on social media, are very tailored to what they think we want to see or what they think we need to see in order to get the desired outcome. And so it's very hard to gauge. And sometimes I think probably most people see through it and we just aren't told that or shown that. And other times I think everyone's given up. So I hope that you're right.
Yeah, but the counter is going to be, again, what the dark forces do to try and superimpose more persecution on it. One of the things that I think that was successful for them, but they didn't reach the level of horrible sort of manifestation, was that whole cancel culture and everybody turning against each other to turn everybody in and shame people and destroy their houses and things like that, destroy their jobs, destroy their careers. So they're going to focus more on that.
Good point.
So that they can turn people against people instead of people uniting against the monsters.
Yes. And we always, no matter what divisions we find for ourselves, like Christian, Muslim, female, male, whatever we might, Republican, Democrat, we always have more in common than we do apart, like always. And we have the same enemies.
Yeah, but it's absolutely true. But what you see happening, and they're doing, again, a very good job and expect more of that polarization. They don't want people coming together on common ground.
Yes.
They want people poles apart on everything they disagree with and subdividing everybody every which way from Sunday so that they can turn on any specific group that they want at any point in time.
Very good point. And that's part of the danger, I think, of identifying too strongly with a group or not having your own mind about things, if you have like weak leadership, like we were talking about earlier, or if you have so identified with it that you just knee-jerk react to whatever stimulus is given to you. That's why things like Black Lives Matter could have started very, with the best intentions, genuinely want to help, the Black community. And then it got like sidelined into all of this that was not helping anybody. And, they can just press a button and control you if you're too quickly identified and without thought, without your own discernment.
Well, and that's a classic example. I mean, everybody wants to be sort of coming off as being empathetic and fair-minded and not racist and not discriminatory. But you have to watch what is controlling these organizations that have maybe at the surface or at the beginning, which seems to be good values, but it's what they do and what they really say you need to keep an eye on. So in this case, when only Black Lives Matter, that's a red flag.
Yeah, it's not true.
I mean, all lives matter. And they were terrorizing people who would say, well, no, all lives matter. Well, something's wrong with that. And I think one of the things we need to focus harder on with people out there as well is that I think a lot of people, whether or not we agree with them or not, or they're of the same religion or not, of the same race or not, whatever, all the multiple subdivisions they like to put us into these days. What we need to understand is that we have to not let them do that. We can't let them continue to subdivide us in ways that the leadership can use superficial things and take us down a road that we're going, wait a minute, how did we get here?
Yeah.
We have to be more critical in our understanding. And, you were talking about, walking into some churches and some of them are having some of them are having fun and some of them aren't.
True.
You walk into a church and people aren't having some fun and they're not happy, something's wrong.
Yeah. I always say,
if all they're doing is having fun, probably something's wrong.
True.
And so we have to recognize that aspect about these things. And I think a lot of people feel this, which was, I kind of got strayed from my point. But the point is I think a lot of people think that something's not quite right, what's going on.
Yeah.
And they're afraid to address it. And they may not be able to totally be able to communicate what they think is not right. Yeah. Or that they're not sure it means that it's so wrong that it might get out of control. But we have to be able to sort of coalesce that as well. Not only what we agree with, but what we think is wrong, we need to be able to agree on from a common ground. And it's quite simple about, fairness and treating everybody with respect and, love over hate. I mean, you don't get a good culture through hate, and nothing good comes from hate. Nothing comes from lies, right? So it has to be truthful, and it has to be based in respect and love and honesty. And we have to use those for standards, and particularly when we're voting. In everything, but from a governmental perspective, is we can't vote for monsters. Yeah. We can't vote for corruption. We can't vote for people who are promoting hate. We can't vote for people who are dividing people. We have to vote for people who are trying to raise society, do more, but in a way that's not designed to destroy the country.
Yeah. In a way that's not focused on, like BLM is destroying the family unit for some reason that is inexplicable.
Yeah, I mean, how can people not look at that and say something's not right with that?
It's like a comedian, JP Sears, pointed out recently. He's like, the only reason they're trying to scrub that from their site is because they don't want people to know what their real goals are. Otherwise, they would just leave it there and say, yeah, that's what we're about. But I don't know many people who are happily, wanting to dismantle the family structure. Maybe you could say you want to make it more inclusive or something. Maybe you want to make it so you can have 2 moms, 2 dads. I don't care, but just destroy it? That's weird.
Yeah. And here's the thing that is I find absolutely astounding, and I'll push back on people, which are their eyes kind of like bug out a little bit when I mention it. But people who are going around saying you should be less white.
Yeah.
I have to tell you, that is so racist.
Yeah.
If somebody said to somebody that was Latino, you need to be less brown.
Yeah.
Or any of the other races, or any of the other types of belief systems, then you would be publicly lynched in social media and everywhere else. But it absolutely is crazy to say you need to be less white. How could you be less white? I mean, you are what you are.
Right.
You can't change who you are. Accept me for who I am. And what comes with that is your character, as Martin Luther King said, judge people on their character, not their skin color.
Yeah, we're not allowed to use that quote anymore because it makes it too obvious what's happening. People are like, well, that's not what he meant. I'm like, I'm pretty sure he meant what he said. That's what he said.
Yes. That's exactly it.
He seems all the context.
Yeah, if it's not taken out of context, that's what he meant.
Yeah.
And then, by the way, follow up with what he's doing, because he's probably doing even worse.
And he, it's interesting that he wanted to focus less on race and more on economic, disparity towards the end. And we lost that message too, I think, in all of the chaos.
Well, and he could never be, and people like to really downplay it today, but Martin Luther King could never be permitted to become who he was, at least without even more, not mistreatment, even though he was mistreated, but more opposition, simply because he's Christian.
Yeah, good point.
And he exuded Christian vows. They would have tarred and feathered him and ran him out of the country.
Yes.
And they would have done the same. They would do the same thing today to President Kennedy.
True. It's so interesting to look back at history of loved people and put them in today's, sphere and wonder how they'd be treated. And most of them would be criticized and called Nazi and all of these things that you're like, we've really come very far down this path of insanity.
Yeah, it is. And so it's interesting times that we live in, and it's certainly not quite, by the detail in the day-to-day events, not quite how I would have imagined it sort of taking shape. You know, you think you have sort of an end sort of picture of what it's going to look like, and then you kind of insert some of the steps in there. But I would never, I always understood the idea of oligarchies, and with the Rockefellers and all the families that control the money that, are controlled by the Rothschilds, controlled by the bloodlines in behind that corporations were a perversion of free enterprise, at least on a transnational scale, like, global corporations, and that they were going to be a big part of trying to control things. But I never saw them as being socialist. I never saw them as in national socialism. I never quite thought that was going to be a case. I thought it would be a partnership, but not such a strong partnership that is setting things up that corporations are going to be greater than nations pretty soon, but in a way that isn't national socialism, but is global socialism. So it's national socialism on a global scale that's being set up. And all of the oligarchs are these elitists that want that feudal system set back up. So whether or not it's communism, socialism, or the old kingships where you have a very small elite class amongst their own families and relatives, and everybody else is poor. And even though you have 4 classes in that traditional system that's still in place today, and was the system all around the world, was the royal ruling family, included the warrior class or the governing class. And then you had the priest class. And then you had the larger merchant class, right? So not a larger, but it was the larger part of the merchant class was the poor people who were doing a little bit of free enterprise. And again, the larger big corporations, whether or not it would be the East Indian Trading Company or Hudson Bay Company or any of those corporations that were owned by the families, you had all this merchant class underneath that they allowed a certain amount of people to rise to a very, very, very small middle class. And then the rest is the servant class, right? The slave class. And that's the 4-class system that they're trying to reset with these oligarchs and their oligarchical corporations. And that's the goal of the reset. That's the goal of what they want to do. They can't raise everybody's standard of living around the world. They can, but they won't. They're too greedy. Right. So what they're going to do is destroy the standard of living in the West, and particularly in North America, and bring that down. They want to bring back what China was, where it was the most equal country in the world, except that everybody was poor.
Yeah, because everybody was poor.
Class. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've been seeing this too, and talking about it, and just trying to describe exactly what you're saying. And exactly like you said, I didn't see it coming this way, but I started to see, it seems like they're turning the U.S. into a third world country, like they're just lowering everything. There's like water that's been poisoned in Flint for years. And there's, and these schools that have literally mushrooms and mold growing out of the ceilings, and, all these places that are falling apart, and it's almost worse than a lot of countries I've been to. And how are we seeing this in the U.S.? And it's just getting worse, especially now that we're seeing this great reset being rolled out. And it's so ironic that it is everybody, all these tools they're using where they're like, you're a Nazi, you're a fascist. And it's like, they're the Nazis and the fascists, literally. But they're getting everyone else to call everyone else that.
Yes, that typical projection. So, and you're seeing it absolutely accurate that the goal is to reduce countries down, and particularly the U.S., because they're so powerful. The U.S. has served its purpose in terms of how the Western families see it. And they can only see this 10 groups of nation empire rising if they're more equal, as opposed to the superpower, the US. Now, it's not quite thought of that way all around the world. So President Trump was pushing against that. He wasn't necessarily against globalism, but he wanted the US to have a bigger role, not a lesser role, and maybe a bigger role than what they had even before. Putin has done the same thing. He's saying, I'm not accepting a small role, I want a bigger role. And that's why he's increasing his empire, and expect him to do it more with the type of leadership we have going on in America today. I mean, he expanded it while that regime was in power before. And same with Xi. He expanded all through the Obama administration and will do so again. And he doesn't like the role that the European families have tried to dictate to Asia or to India. So you're going to see a little bit more pushback around the world, only because these other powers are saying, we want our position of the 10 to be the strongest, or significantly more than we have today, at least. And in the meantime, you've got this seesaw going back in America about which direction it's going, and it ends up going nowhere, except a slow sort of slide, but not in a very sort of quick way. So it's very, very painful.
Yeah, they're just extending the suffering. I'm really glad that you put it that way, because I have this, this strange respect for Donald Trump that I never expected. And I have the same thing for Putin. And I'm like, why? Because I know these people aren't truly good. I don't know that, but I feel like they're probably not. So it makes me very concerned that I have this respect. With the way you just said it, I'm like, oh, I get it, because they are pushing back in a way, and so I respect that, but they're not necessarily doing it for my benefit, so I can't really get behind them 100%.
Well, anything that pushes back on this regime that is so, I guess, I was going to say monstrous, but beast-like, keep it scriptural,
right?
Is something you have to at least support in a way. You don't have to be a believer in that person or that party, but if it stops and slows without doing total evil in the world, and it's way less evil than who was trying to persecute you and is teeing up genocide against you,
literally,
then yeah, I mean, I don't have to like what President Trump acted, or I don't have to like how he talked. But I do recognize what he has done, and I do like his policies. And even though he can't, and what the thing is, what the Democrats really hate about Donald Trump is he was the Democrat before, so he talks like a Democrat, which is why it seems so harsh to us, because we're not used to having our politicians talk that way and do things that way, and why it's double hurtful against the left, because nobody's ever done that to them. They've never had that. They've never been spoken to that way. But what he's done is he has ripped off the scab, so to speak, to show us how fixed the system is, how corrupt the system is, how many levels, to that degree of controlling way more than what we thought, and what they all had to do to band together to take him out of power.
It was pretty amazing, because it was so obvious, or for me at least. Again, I don't know. I feel like a lot of people saw through it finally, but I never expect them to really play their hand that openly.
Neither did I, especially with shutting down the voting.
Yeah.
Because they knew they didn't have enough ballots that were fake.
Yes.
And they had to use more. I mean, and people say, well, there's no proof. Well, define proof. I mean, there's over 5,000 affidavits.
Yeah.
And nobody's actually looked at the proof.
Right. They're like,
and then nobody's actually looked at, well, they've looked at it, but no judges will accept a premise that it was all unconstitutional by changing the laws by edict as opposed to through the state legislatures. And even in this last go around, where the Supreme Court said they would look after it after the inauguration, they refused to look at it.
Oh my God. I don't understand how that part wouldn't make anybody upset, no matter what, side you're on, just that the courts won't even look at it. And people don't even ask why, I'm like, you don't even want to know why, because no matter what, again, side you're on, wouldn't you hope that at least somebody who had a concern could have it settled by a supposedly impartial system?
Yeah. Or at least an investigation.
Right.
They won't even look at it. They won't. And you want to convince people and be transparent that it wasn't fixed. I'm not American, but I know when I went to sleep that night, there's no way it was mathematically possible to lose that election at that point in time. And in fact, part of the affidavits, there was 2 of them from a couple of different very high level schools with mathematicians saying each of those was 1 in 1 quadrillion chance of happening, which is below mathematical 0, which is usually measured at about 3.5 trillion. And we're in the quadrillions, and that happened 5 times over.
Wow.
But nobody wants to look at the math. Nobody wants to look at, and then they were able to get rid of so much of the evidence, and you can't get any kind of investigation. And so when they won't allow an investigation, you know something's not right, and something's not right in a big way. So the question gets to be is, okay, so if it's recognized that things aren't changed, and it's hard to believe how this is going to be peeled back so that you can have a fair election again.
Right.
With when you saw how much power they have to block the investigations, to make sure it's not heard in court properly, and how they actually brought things about and will prevent things from changing it. It's hard to imagine, no matter how many people get out and vote, that the next election won't be fixed as well.
Yeah. That's why I keep hearing people saying, well, we got to do this and we got to do that. And I'm like, what do we do when the system itself is literally broken, and we can see that so clearly? And that explosion, and was it Nashville, and it just so happened to be where the Dominion machines were at that point, and the name Dominion is such a slap in the face. It's so in Canada, and not that they do everything right here, because we do not, but until there's changes that come, and I dread the day that it's coming, but I know with what the left does in Canada, they take their marching orders from those in control in the United States. That's, also from around the world, but mostly from the US in this region, that they'll try and change the election. But how we do election today is with a pencil and a hand ballot. Yeah.
And we have to have ID. And guess what? A passport is not acceptable.
How?
It doesn't have your address on it.
Oh, it doesn't?
You have to have picture ID.
With your address.
With your address.
Yeah, it's like getting an ID is harder than voting.
And the count takes only 2 hours to do.
Wow.
So I don't know very hard. It's very hard to make an election like that fraudulent. It just takes way too much effort, and it's so simple.
Yeah. And I wonder too if they're going to try to usher in some of their transhumanist crap with this, by saying like, oh, I guess there were so many problems with the election. Here, get this chip in your arm, and now you can vote, and we'll be sure that only 1 vote per person, and it's all counted.
Well, they won't want to do that,
because they'll be too fair.
Yes.
Yeah, true.
They'll do something like that's too much invasion of personal privacy, even though they're selling everything that you do on the net all around the world.
True.
But they'll probably come at it that way, because typically they're quite duplicitous.
Very. Yeah, they will literally say one thing and then turn around and do the opposite.
But we can hope. We can hope that there will be some changes, and but it's with what we saw, it's very, very hard to believe unless there is such a groundswell. And who knows? I mean, you could have such a despicable run by the people in power today that might happen. But I think they're prepared to bring in martial law. I think they're prepared to do whatever they have to do to stay in power, you've got bills to change the election laws right now. I think it's called the Fairness Act or the Equality Act or something like that. That's going to pass through Congress. Not convinced it gets through the Senate, But that doesn't mean they won't do it through governor edict or Biden is going to probably do as much as he can through executive orders, and then just see whether or not, even though it's supposedly a conservative Supreme Court, it hasn't really proven that yet, at least of late. Will they even overturn any of Biden's executive orders? We'll have to wait and see. But right now, I don't see all of the pushback by all of the conservatives and all of the state attorney generals taking all of these things to court. I've only heard one on immigration. There should be like 50 cases in 50, let's say 30 or 40 states.
Yeah.
And I'm not seeing that. So we certainly saw that from the Democrats, but if the Republicans who are controlling the party aren't hearing what people were talking about at CPAC this week and what they're believing, I mean, the Republican Party is going to explode, which means the next few elections are gone. But maybe something better will come out of it. But right now, the way things are, we need, the right needs even the globalists in the Republican parties and the rhinos and all the other ones to still be there to get their vote. But if they're not going to stand up for what happened, it's going to blow up.
Yeah, I think that is a really good point. And I think you're right about martial law. They've got the Capitol wrapped in razor wire and all these troops there, and it's insane. And they're saying it's going to be there until September, which doesn't make any sense at all. There's no reason. They just apparently picked that month, like on a dartboard.
It's the poster for calling everybody who opposes the Democratic Party as terrorists. And they are, in every aspect, redefining anybody who disagrees politically with them is a terrorist. And they're arming, as we talk, Homeland Security and the FBI to hunt us down like Al-Qaeda.
Yeah. People don't realize it, and they're like, oh, where's your evidence? You read that on a conspiracy site. I'm like, no, here's the bill. It was introduced into you could read it on.
Here's the bill.
Yeah.
And go back and listen to Biden's speech, his acceptance speech. He declared war on his political enemies. The only unification he's interested in is their code word, which they use all of the time, is the Democratic Party unification. That's the only unification they're interested in.
Yeah, and that's.
But he literally called everybody who voted against him a terrorist, and they're going to have a war on domestic terrorism. And in the weeks leading up to that, they were defining who they were, and they basically defined everybody who's even left of center isn't far enough left of center.
Wow. It's really crazy. And it's interesting too. And I wonder if you have any ideas about that, January 6th day. I think they wanted that to be a bloodbath. And I think they thought they had the division and the hate stoked so high, and they had the right players in that they were going to make this right. And then it didn't. And that made me so happy.
And you're never going to see a proper investigation on this.
Because it would prove too much.
Yeah. So what we do know is President Trump had offered 10,000 troops. On the weekend before.
Interesting.
And Pelosi turned them down. And what we do know is the FBI was briefing Pelosi and probably McConnell on all the information that they had, that there was going to be trouble and that they needed to beef up the security. And that's all out there on documentation right now. Not that the media is going to ever cover it. And they didn't. And in fact, they had probably the lowest level of security they've had in the last 40 years.
Ever.
That. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in some places, it took 30 seconds to get through. And in other places, there were gaps in the fencing.
Yes.
And the police chief from Washington, who got fired or had to resign, was pleading and asked 7 times for more people based on the information he had. So where's the investigation on particularly Pelosi, who controls that aspect for the security? And why didn't she, with that information, with that briefing, why didn't she call for more security?
Yes.
because they didn't want it. They got exactly what they were looking for, even though there was nobody that was killed in a physical way except for one that was a protester
Right.
who was shot
By the cop.
and of course the lies about how the policeman died, and we're still not sure how, but it wasn't with a fire extinguisher or anything like that, and they think it might have been a reaction to the tear gas or something like that.
Yeah.
But
no one's ever going to
so
hear
the
that.
only the only people that got killed was the protester from direct violence,
right.
and there's still been no proper investigation by the looks of as to who and why she was shot, in terms of who shot her and what's going on with that. It was done in 3 hours.
Yeah. Like,
there was no weapons, there was no guns, there was no bombs, there was nothing like that. People went home, and this is bigger than the perpetual terrorizing of cities, and even with Portland, it's still ongoing. Was going on there on the weekend again. That is looked at as perfectly fine.
And when you,
it's just,
and when you
it's
bring
a dichotomy that is unbelievable.
And when you bring any of that up, their main response, instead of to address every one of those very accurate points you just made, is to just call you a racist. It's racist that the cops weren't there on the Capitol on that day, and it's racist to criticize rioting, and it's racist somehow to do anything at all that doesn't just go along with the narrative. So I'm like, well, that's convenient for you. No matter what I do, I'm a racist. So
yeah.
Okie dokie.
Yeah. And because of that, you're probably a terrorist.
Yes, that's the other thing, and that's the one.
And then on the new hit list for Homeland Security and the FBI.
Yeah, I think I've been on that for a while, but we'll see.
And then what they did, what was amazing, and very little coverage of it, is that Bank of America went through anybody who bought anything in and around Washington, flying in hotels, buying a cup of coffee, and gave that to the FBI. That's illegal.
Wow. Oh, did I even hear about this? Or was there another? I don't know. That's insane that people... This is the thing. I feel like there's so many attacks on us from so many angles that people just become numb. And, you know, like, which one do I respond to? There's so many.
Well, exactly.
Wow.
And Bank of America's permission is, well, we're required to cooperate with the FBI. That's true, but only if there's something illegal that they've detected.
Yeah.
Not just and there was no
willy-nilly.
warrant. There was no court order to do it.
It's just insane.
Now, this hasn't happened in Portland. This hasn't happened in New York. This hasn't happened in Seattle. It didn't happen in Chicago. It did not anywhere else. That has never happened.
And that's the other thing. I just don't know if you're anything near an honest person, how you could look at all of this and imagine that any of it's fair. It's all being applied so lopsidedly and so, you know, very, very discriminatory. You know what I mean? And if you're an honest person, you have to be able to admit that. It's very obvious. You know, even if you agree with it or not, you have to admit it's being carried out in a very, very lopsided way, only targeting very specific people. People ignore that. And okay, so let's get a little bit weird. For maybe not for either of us, but maybe not for the audience either. But there was this very specific image of Kamala Harris at an interview before, the election. And her eyes look just jet black, no white at all, and her face looks very weird, and she's acting very strangely, and in my opinion, she is possessed by a demon. I'd love to know what you think about that. And also, there's this thing that very easily could be Photoshopped, I have no idea, but it looks like something pops out of Joe Biden's arm, like his cuff during the debate, one of the debates, and I want to get your opinion on those things.
Well, I have no idea whether or not she's possessed or not. I'm thinking probably not.
Really?
But, probably not. And we're going to have to keep an eye on the power that she's gaining. She is quite a radical, and it's not clear who's running the government right now.
No, it's not.
That is very, very scary right now. And there's more and more questions on that. And the cognitive abilities are in steep decline of Joe Biden. So I'm not quite sure what you're referring to as something sort of up his sleeve.
Looks like a
I would
weird
generally think thousands
snake.
of notes that were, but
Yeah.
just for reminders, just kidding. But there's, there's something going on, and it could be part of dementia or not, where sometimes you're, a lot more lucid than other times. So it's kind of hills and valleys, or he's being drugged up. I mean, a couple of days ago, I think, was it yesterday? I think it was yesterday down in Texas. I mean, that was not good.
I didn't see it. Was he?
Oh, he could not remember even with reading, and he couldn't read who he was introducing. He was asking what he was doing there.
Wow.
And then they kind of pulled him off pretty quickly after that. So it's hard to know what's going on there. And this is one of the most, I'm not sure what the right word for it is, the cover up on keeping him as the nomination, making him the nomination, and lying to his cognitive abilities. Whether or not it's going to be properly investigated, probably not, because we know the left never gets really properly investigated. It's probably one of the biggest scandals ever, but it's hard to rank them when you look at what they did to President Trump in the first 4 years.
Right.
So is that really surprising? And that they even, they had to do what they did in the election, even with the control of everything that they had, to bring those results around that are, technically, mathematically impossible based on until the magical closing down of all the election polls in the key states.
It's so insane. It's it's really, really interesting, and this is something that always gives me hope, is like I said on the Capitol on January 6th, and the fact that so many people did vote for Trump, and they had to work so hard to try and cheat that gives me hope that, like you said, despite all that control for 4 years and all the complete control of the media and all of the messaging getting through, that still didn't work out how they wanted it to. That gives me hope.
Yeah, so I think they're probably will be trying to figure out, how do we make this not so obvious the next time?
Yeah.
But if you allow complete election changes that Pelosi is trying to introduce, but they're going to have to go back to what they did the last time. They're going to have to do it by fiat, not through the legislatures, because they don't control enough of the state legislatures to do that. And certainly in the states that they're trying to do it in, they don't control those legislatures. Except for maybe Michigan, but I'm not sure that that's easily done there either. What was interesting about the ruling of the Supreme Court in Wisconsin was that the Supreme Court there ensured, because it was driven by the Chief Justice there, that no matter what the lower judges did, put it through the process and we'll give you an avenue to the Supreme Court. Well, it lost 3-2, and the dissenting report that the Chief Justice said is that it is absolute, and that with what the three justices did to not overturn the election has entrenched fraudulent elections going forward for who knows how long.
Wow.
It was the most powerful dissent by a Chief Justice that I've read in a very, very long time, in terms of the implications and how totally biased those three judges were.
Wow. Yeah, that's the hard part too, is when you start to see how it's at every level, in every sphere, except the citizenry. I think if we were genuinely able to communicate easily and share information without all of this ego and hatred that, we are pretty much not completely satanically controlled, but it's like, it's the legislature, it's the Senate, it's the judiciary, it's the executive branch, and it's the voting system. It's like all of it. And that gets pretty hopeless. But it is just still interesting that despite all of that, they're still, not in complete control. That's amazing.
Well, that's why we're so dangerous. And that's why Christianity is so dangerous. And that's why they're going to do in the end time what they're going to do, because we're so dangerous.
It's funny because I try to point out to people how Christianity specifically is targeted unlike any other religion, and they just don't see it. We've been trained to think of Christianity as really oppressive and hateful and archaic, and every other religious tradition as perfect, wonderful, deserving of all of our acceptance. And and I'm all for acceptance of everyone. Do and believe whatever you want, but I would love if people could just see this targeting of Christianity. They just don't. It's a very strange spell.
Globalists are the arch enemies of Christians, and they see Christians as their only stumbling block to accomplishing what they want. And so they'll play for so long, and then they'll do what all these groups have done in the past. They're going to turn to persecution and genocide. That's what they do. And it doesn't matter whether or not you're talking about World War II with Hitler and the genocide against, the Holocaust against the Jewish people, and he would have turned to Christians and other people after that, or with what the Chinese did. And Christians were a big part of that genocide that went on in China, which was over 60 million, which may be a low count. Some people put it as high as 100 million. It's what Stalin did in the Ukraine. This is their MO. So if they and what people who support these people, what they're doing, what they don't realize is that they're going to come from them for the most part as well too.
Yes. And these people carrying this out are, these bloodline families, like they're descended from these Nephilim giant, or at least their belief system. And so they know, because the Nephilim back then knew that these were their only stumbling blocks. So it's very interesting. This spiritual war has been going on forever.
It has, and it's an amazing thing, and that's why they can easily persuade their followers that this is the dualism, which is what polytheism is all about, like good against evil in perpetuity, that one never really wins, but you're always in a battle, like in the Star Wars sort of series, and that they're actually the good people, and that the Christians are the evil people, and their gods are the good gods, and the God of the Bible is the evil God, the evil God who caused the flood, the evil God who had Israel slaughter all of these innocent people in the promised land, the evil God that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, the evil God this, the evil, and that's what they truly believe.
True.
And so they elevate their gods to a level as being as powerful as the God in the Bible, which the angels know is not true, because they knew God intimately. Even when they rebelled, they know how powerful he was. They knew they could never win. They only wanted to win another realm, to live away from God. As Satan said in Isaiah, he wanted to be like God and to raise his throne to be like God, not to defeat God, but to have his own realm.
His realm's
they knew they couldn't defeat him.
Really shitty realm. I don't know why people want to go there. It's like, reminds me of a teenager, it's like, fine, I'm gonna go live over here, and just moves out, and you're like, I mean, it's gonna be really bad for you, you just don't know it yet, but go do it, I guess, if that's what you need to do. It's weird to me talking about the giants, because I was just reading The Unseen Realm by Michael something.
Heiser.
Okay, thank you. And it's like super, super light Gary Wayne. It's like kind of a lot of the similar stuff, and I haven't finished it yet, so maybe I'm wrong. But he says he says there's no evidence of giants archaeologically. And I thought there was a lot of evidence of giants archaeologically, and that, the Smithsonian did a lot to cover that up, and who knows who else worked to cover it up. So I'd love to get your take on that, and also on why would the Smithsonian or anyone cover up the archaeological evidence if they're super happy to be following their crazy path? Why do they want to hide it?
So I think Dr. Heiser has done a lot of good work. I haven't reviewed it, only from what I understand, that because there's a lot of information out there about him, but he doesn't come at things from a Christian perspective.
Does not.
So he does not. More of a secular Judaic perspective, I would say. And he accepts aspects of the Bible, but not all of it. Much of the New Testament he doesn't, and certainly he rejects the millennium as not valid.
Oh.
And so I'm not here to, but just to criticize, just trying to lay on. And he says he doesn't have an approach for the Bible. He just does research. So understand that. So it's typical, though, that you have to be careful, because there's a lot of people who are either easily deceived against the evidence or part of the disinformation to say there isn't any evidence. And so, if you go to some sites that are out there, and one that I always like, and it's called Old Newspaper Articles, and I have the link for that if people want to get hold of me. And you can go to this link where it lists discoveries of the giants in mostly North America from these newspapers from about 1850 to about 1950. And in every case, you'll have where it was the remains were taken by the local university and then to the Smithsonian, or the Smithsonian went directly in and took them. And they have all of these descriptions in these articles, and you can go to their far right-hand column and click on it, actually bring up the newspaper article, and it'll describe whether it's an 8-foot giant or a 12-foot giant, and where it was, what town, and what year, and you get all of that information. But it just sort of disappears when it gets to the Smithsonian, even though you've got this paper trail that goes right back to them. And what most people won't tell you about the Smithsonian Institute is it wasn't even funded to be started by Americans. It was funded through the estate of James Smithson, who was a Rosicrucian of the Royal Society.
Of course.
And the money was given to Masons in the United States, mostly who were senators and representatives and presidents, to create the Smithsonian Institute, which reports to the Royal Society today. And James Smithson was a Rosicrucian. So they're not there to reveal all the secrets of the world. They're there to control the information for the Royal Society. And again, I have an article on that if people want that. It's an interesting, quick little read about things that I've just talked about. And so the Royal Society, which is controlled by Freemasons and Rosicrucians, was established as such, who all science still answers to today, because it was the organization that brought modern science to the world. And they actually called themselves the last of the sorcerers and the first of the scientists. But it's still polytheistic driven, which is why they honor the pantheon of gods the same way as Enoch the evil did and polytheism did in the past. And though they have 4 principles that they do, and you can see it in science today. And I'll start with the last one, which is to honor their pantheon of gods. So they name everything after their gods. They build buildings after buildings in history that were dedicated to the gods. So whether or not it's the university and the degree system, which is the mystical system, right, of knowledge, the cult of knowledge, and all of that sort of aspect, it's all there to honor their pantheon of gods. But the 3 major ones on the side that should interest Christians is that their goal, just as it was with Enoch the evil, was to not to give God credit for anything, to degrade God, and to degrade God, not give God credit for anything, and to totally dismiss God as being the all-powerful God of the universe. And so, and creator of all things. And that's why in science, anything is permitted as long as it has nothing to do with creationism or anything that might have a whiff of it, because they're not there to look at things objectively. They're only there to look at it from how they want to control the information. They'll bring science back to polytheism, when they're ready to show the wizard behind the curtain who's been controlling it for all of this time. So this is the organization that controls the Smithsonian Institute. Shouldn't be any surprise.
No, it's so fascinating too. I never really thought so deep. I mean, I knew they hid things, and I know like every organization does. So I didn't think too deeply about the Smithsonian. And I was in some old thrift store and I found a book, a hardcover, huge book about the Smithsonian. And even in the first like 3 pages, I was like, wow, this organization is very occult. Like they have like a scepter, and they had, all their occult symbolism all over the place. And I was like, okay, this is pretty obvious. Like, I should have bought that book. It was actually really neat, but I didn't. But yeah, that's who they are. And you just laid it out for us really well. So I have a weird question about the Nephilim too. I was just thinking today about it, and I was like, okay, and I knew you could help me understand this. So if the Nephilim are fallen angels who came and mostly raped, right? But at least had sex with women, gave birth to these, Nephilim giants. Why would that make them automatically evil? Weren't their soul then still created by God? Because, do you know what I mean? Like what just,
well, let's get
can't they be good if they want? Don't they have free will?
Are you talking about the fallen angels or the giants?
The offspring,
took anybody there chose?
The giants.
Okay. So in polytheism, you actually get that sort of duality. That's sort of the micro duality that's within it. So you've heard of the term white magic and black magic. So within the belief system, they have their own good versus evil as well. And so you will have a good witch, or a white witch, and a dark witch, right? And you will also have good Nephilim and bad Nephilim. So an example of a good Nephilim would be, as people understand it today, would be Hercules. Because he was fighting against the evil Nephilim, right? The bad ones. What you have to remember though, and again, this will have 2 different meanings, whether or not you're polytheist or you're monotheist. What you have to remember is that Hercules or Theseus or Perseus, which would be typically the good ones of the Greek mythology and history, they still worship their pantheon of gods.
And none
so
of
whether
them...
it's good magic or black magic, it's still occult magic.
But could they be good? Could they choose to not go along with that? And this again
sure
comes...
they could. Okay. Sure they could.
That's what I'm wondering, because this again comes from the book I was just reading that made it sound like they're automatically evil no matter what. And I was like, is that fair? Do they have free will?
So in everybody has free choice. And so I actually write in the book that nobody is automatically denied salvation just because they're born the way they're born, right? The physical attributes isn't the issue. It's what you choose and then what you do. And so you need to choose God. So if they choose God and Jesus, then there's no reason that God's son who was crucified, that his sacrifice isn't large enough to cover all of those sins. The only sin that's not covered is blasphemies against the Holy Spirit, which seems to be akin to violations against the laws of creation. So those who violate those laws are violating or blaspheming the Holy Spirit, similar to what the mark tends to do at the end time, because they go to the lake of fire as well and burn forever, not the second death. And so the thing to keep in mind about that is that means then that if they chose to follow God and not the pantheon of gods, then God could choose to save them, right? Because they did good things. Just as Romans talks about that at the judgment, they're going to be judged as to what they believed, what was in their heart, and measured against what they did if they didn't believe in Jesus. So there's an opening there that Romans talks about, that God can save anybody he wants based on sort of their own laws that were in their heart, that how they followed those laws, and the spirit of those laws, I guess, would probably be a better understanding of that. And so when we look at some of the things that happened after the flood and in the times of Israel, and in the times, let's say, of the mighty men of David. And some of those aren't from Israel. You have like Uriah the Hittite. And one presumes that because the Hittites were a hybrid people, and therefore would have been an offspring. But he was fighting for God and Jesus, that if they believed in God, if Uriah did, that why would he not be saved? And then you have an interesting scenario in the time of the Exodus, and you have the Gibeonites, who are Hivim, the Hivites, but Hivim as in the Hivim Rephaim. Just as you have Zebulon, who's called a Hivim in Genesis 36. And they're called both Gibeonites and Hivim. And these are the ones Joshua makes a peace treaty with, even though he's not permitted to do that, but he's deceived by them. But God honors this peace treaty anyways. And then the Hivim, or the Gibeonites, as they're sort of called thereafter, are going to become the servants of the temple. And they're going to have a bloodline and a family of that continue to be workers in the temple and all throughout Israeli history. And they're actually called the Nethinim by the time they're included in the peoples coming back from Babylon. So if they're allowed to work in the temple, one would think that there's room for that salvation and that they would have been believing in God. But again, it would come down to what was in their hearts too, right? Sure. So I think we get some biblical examples where we don't want to go out and judge, which we're not supposed to do anyways, and leave that to the domain of the divine, who is in charge of that. We're not. And so we want to be careful not to prejudge what God's going to do, because he's all knowing, and his plan is something that we're not privy to in all of the details. So I choose to leave that to God. But I think there's an avenue there to sort of bring this to a close, that there could have been some good Nephilim, there could have been some good Rephaim, there could have been some good descendants, and if they were, depending on the situation and the acceptance of God and Jesus, depending on when they lived, that there's an avenue there for their salvation.
I love that. That's just a good reminder too, that your allies could be anywhere, and if you're not judging everyone, you still have good boundaries, like have discernment and keep yourself safe. But if you're not judging, you could find allies in very unexpected places.
Yeah, and one would expect Caleb to be part of that. He's a Kenizzite, whose people, depending on how you're going to take his lineage back, is he back to Kenaz out of the Table of Nations, or is he one of those Kenites that's talked about and Kenizzites talked in Genesis 15 that predate Kenaz from the lineage? And he was part of the spies, the scouts, right? And he's the one who actually inherited areas around Jerusalem, in particular the areas of Hebron and Kiriath Arba, the home of King Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, the Anakim giant kings. And Caleb actually goes back to the Hebrew word dog. And there's a lot of sort of speculation, was he part of sort of the dog warriors, because he was kind of like a mercenary, and dog warriors were mercenaries, and his name means Caleb. So was that a title or not really his real name that was changed to that because he was a mercenary? But was he some sort of Nephilim? I mean, I know I'm speculating on all of that, but just sort of throwing that out, that there's a lot of things that the Bible talks about that you really gotta sort of try and understand and try and make sense of. And so I think he's probably a descendant of Kenaz based on the time frame that it would likely go back to that. But we need to be open that Kenizzite is described as a patriarchless family that's not in the Table of Nations in Genesis 15.
And this is interesting too, because then I start wondering, it's weird for me because I've really hated AI my whole life, and robotics and all of these things. They just seem like a really convenient way for demons to slip into, whatever they would like to. And so I just don't trust them. And yet I then wonder, could an AI be actually good? And I don't even like to consider it, but I kind of have to. And I wonder what you think about that.
Whether
Well,
artificial intelligence is going to be good. Well, what does it base its value? Yeah, what does it base its value system on?
Satanists that built it, I'm guessing.
Or its own. And does it accept God? Does it accept Jesus? I mean, but does it actually have morality?
Can it actually have even intelligence, or is it just sort of a ruse even?
Well,
like sometimes I think it's not even real and they're just trying to freak us all out.
Well, and one wonders whether or not you can actually give that sort of life as being sentient, right? Or is this going to be more of an avenue for the demons to operate through?
That's what I feel like.
And that's where the intelligence comes from.
And then if you're a demon, you would not be good. So, yeah. Did you know that Elon Musk's child's name apparently translates to Archangel AI Unknown Variable?
I had not heard that. What's the name of his child?
It's something like, it's just a list of like letters and symbols, but someone somewhere like kind of translated that out, and that's apparently what it could stand for.
He is deeply into AI. He's deeply into occult science, and he knows about things and has given some warnings from what he knows that have scared him.
Yes.
Right.
But then he seemed to kind of give up on that and just go along with it. And his wife has this song that says, we know AI, something like, we know AI is greater than us, so we're just going to worship it because like we want to, or something.
Or be destroyed, right? So was probably threatened. So, and his family.
I just can't imagine going along with that. Like, I'd rather die.
Depending on what your belief system is.
True.
If your belief system isn't centered in something that is quite a bit different than the occult belief system, then you would just accept it, right? But if you're Christian, for example, then no, you're not going to accept that no matter what.
That's a good point. How sad. Okay, so to totally shift gears, there's this concept, again, from that book that I'm reading that talks about geographical area as though literal land is owned by gods, various gods, either God or like what they consider gods. Is that how it is?
Well, that's what the Bible says.
That is what it says.
I'll tell you how I think he gets at that. So let's start with Psalm 82. And there's a council of gods.
Yeah.
And these are the children of the Most High. These are the sons of God. These are rebellious angels that are, because they're going to die like men in the end time. And they're princes. And princes has, relationships with the names that are in Deuteronomy 32 and to angels and things like that in terms of ruling and majesty. So, and because they're also called princes in Psalms 82 as well. And princes goes back also to the word El, which means not only an angel, but mighty. So what's going on here with Psalms 82 is giving us an understanding that there's a council of gods that oversees the earth, and that we also know from the New Testament that Satan is the prince of this world. He's the god of this world. So this council that is run by the fallen angels would be answering to Satan until the end time. And then in Deuteronomy 32, to paraphrase it, I think it's in verses 7, 8, and 9. It talks about the number of the nations, which are the same number as Adam, the sons of Adam in the antediluvian epoch, and the same number as the amount of children born to Jacob in Israel which is 70, as scripture tells us. And those are also the 70 patriarchs, with a few patriarchless ones in the Canaanite clan who don't have a patriarch that are included in those numbers of the nations. And that's why it's called the Table of Nations. And one piece of property is reserved by God, which is the covenant land that is promised to Abraham. So this is the council of gods that rules over the 70 nations that were divided up from the beginning, so beforehand. And you're going to have 70 gods that are reigning over those original 70 nations, both before and then again after the flood. And so you can imagine that these nations are expanding out from the time of Babel, right? And that they'll create other nations and as they expand around the world. So you're going to have offspring nations of those nations that are going to go back to one of those 70 and then funneled into probably 7 main angels, which is a standard number in the pantheon and gods around the world. And if you understand the tens of tens in Enoch, 10 times 7 is 70, which probably is the representatives that's governing the throne. Now, what's interesting about the gods is that and this is a common understanding in polytheism, that there's a council of gods as well. That's talked about in many of the cultures that run the world. And what's interesting about the gods is that you have 2 sets of gods. You have the parent gods and you have the offspring gods. So without making this too laborious, you have Kronos and Gaia in the Greek mythology. They're part of a dozen parent gods, and it's similar in all the other religions, whether or not it is, like Anu and Ki, let's say in the Sumerian pantheon. And then they have offspring gods. So Zeus would be an offspring god, just as Anki or Enlil would be, just as Osiris would be. And these are all the same pantheons, just different vernacular names. And then you have what is generally accounted for in polytheism is that the offspring gods are going to overthrow the parent gods, and they just kind of disappear and they kind of kill them. But you can't kill an immortal being. They just kind of disappear. But where do they disappear to? I think those are the angels that were put in the abyss for the crimes before the flood.
How convenient.
And that's the convenient story that the offspring's God. So gods like Baal take over from El in Canaan after the flood. And that's the Baalim who start to rule from Mount Hermon again after the flood. But then they kind of disappeared. And I wonder whether or not that's because they did a second incursion, and so they would have had to go to the flood. And what's interesting in a gospel called the Gospel of the Pistis of Sophia in Gnosticism, and again, I can send it to people, I'll give them just the write-up on it. It describes these gods that are in the abyss. And so if you can imagine like the Ogdo gods, which are the parent gods of the Egyptian pantheon, and you've got serpentine looking gods, and you have multiple head gods, and you've got different other kinds of gods like Anubis, it's a jackal god. And then you've got, lion gods and things like that. That's kind of what's made up of all of these beings that are in the abyss. That's talked about gods that were put in there after the flood. So Gnosticism doesn't tend to talk as much about this sort of overthrow that some of the other culture ones, because it's kind of a cosmology and conflation of all the world religions to get that universal end time religion. And they're actually talking about these gods that are there that were in the abyss. But I also think there's a second set that were put in there, and that's why you don't hear much beyond, let's say, 100 years or so after the flood, much about Baal, other than he's worshipped, but he doesn't really have presence. In fact, when you get into the Ugaritic text, they're actually doing fertility incarnations to have Baal come back and create more Rephaim, because they have a fertility issue within that post-Diluvian giant species kind of thing. So that's how I would sort of piece that all together, that I think Dr. Heiser is talking about. Sorry, I got something wrong with my earplug here.
Yeah, that helps.
And and that's where it comes at it scripturally. And then in Deuteronomy 4, and I think it's in the teens, but it's in Deuteronomy 4 for sure. It actually talks about the heavenly host that is worshipped as gods, like the stars, the sun, and the moon, that was given over to these gods, where he divided the earth amongst them, paraphrasing it. So we get several different points within the Bible that kind of triangulate that. And then when you start to hear about these other kinds of gods that are described, and I'll just use the English words in the New Testament. So if it's talking about the powers or the principalities or the dominions or the authorities or the rulers of darkness, this is part of that hierarchical structure. That's part of the assembly of gods that Psalms 82 talks about, that govern the nations.
Wow. Yeah, that's so interesting to have that perspective now. When I'm reading that text, everything makes a lot more sense, where he's coming from and what's going on. So thank you.
So what's interesting about the words that they use, depending on the translation that you're reading, if you're reading like a King James version, it's saying the sons of Israel in there, it's counted as the sons of Israel. And people say, well, Israel wasn't before the flood. Yeah. Well, that's just the word that Jacob was given as the name to change his name into. And it actually means it's a compound word put together. So it's put together as we understand Israel today, but that's before Israel was created. So it should be there as separate words, not compounded together. But it's been compounded together even in the Hebrew manuscript. But it basically comes from Sarah and El, which is a god. And Sarah, in this application, as it's coming out of Hebrew, so the I would be silent, Sarael, Israel, as other people might want to pronounce it, but it means basically princes and rulers. So it basically means of the children of Israel there, as you see it, is basically the sons, which is Ben, so the sons of the ruling God. And that's why in the Septuagint and in some other translations, it will say the sons of God there, or angels, or some other translation.
Interesting. So Israel is saying that this is the nation of, not of the God, the Most High, right?
Well, yeah, those are the gods that are running it both before and after the flood. And even if some are replaced, I mean, they're still running it because people just move up in rank, because it's a host or an army of angels, as they're called, both loyal and disloyal, and there's a hierarchy to it. And so the word there that's used, because Jacob is changes his name to that compounded word that we know as Israel today. It's what I call one of those kind of dual prophecies. It has an implication for the time that it's being prophesied, and that's the time of the conquest, where Israel is going to seize the land that God preserved for himself, and down through Shem and down through Arksvad and down through Abraham, that he bequeathed to Abraham. That's his, where the Nephilim or the Rephaim and the Canaanites intermarried with them, who illegally seized that land and squatted it. And the Hamites aren't supposed to be there. They're supposed to be over in Africa, where all the other Hamites are for the most part. And so they've squatted that. And this is the land that Israel's going to take back by force. But it's a prophecy of the land and the justification for Israel, that this is my land that I gave to Abraham, and these people have defiled my land, and you're going to take it and become a priest of God, or a nation of priests for God. And so that's the prophecy at hand. But it's also has these prophecies have prehistory that's embedded into it, that gives it its defining nature, which is why he's talking about the sons of Adam. When this division was done, that was implemented, but edicted or commanded before creation, right? So it's all been sort of part of the plan. And then this is the governing nations that are going to continue right up until the end time, that are going to war with God in the end time. So you have to understand that all of this is going to come back to have an important play in the end time. That's what I call a dual prophecy. So Isaiah 14 would be one of those, where you have prehistory about Satan, and you have the king of Babylon, and then you've got some end time stuff that looks like Antichrist, but it's also a prophecy for the time of Isaiah. But you have to understand the prehistory to understand the prophecy and know which is for which sort of region. So people think king of Babylon is Satan, because you've got the king of Babylon called Hel-El, which is Helel, but Lucifer, as it comes out in the King James Version Bible, is an Italian word for the Hebrew word Hel-El, which is not Helel, it's Heyel, and Helel, the king of Babylon, is an allegory coming out of that meaning. So that's an Antichrist type figure, just as the king of Babylon is, and that's why you have a king of Babylon in the end time and the religion of Babylon in the end time, because it's prophetic also for the end time. And you have to understand it in that context, what's being relayed. And you also have the prophecy of the time, where you're going to have Nebuchadnezzar, who's actually going to create a kind of abomination with the destruction of the temple, and setting himself as being the God of the world during his reign, and he's punished for it for 7 years. So it's prophetic of those events. You have to understand it. And so once you start to understand that Isaiah 13 and 14 are the same prophecy, and then when you start to get into the serpent's root that's talked about later on in that, it starts to make some sense if you understand that prehistory that's going into it.
Wow. And this is part of how they discredit things too, is they'll say like, oh, well, no, those prophecies were already fulfilled back then. This isn't for the future. Like, we're just misunderstanding or whatnot.
Exactly. That's the misinformation. But that's why you have to recognize. And there's like Ezekiel 28 is another one. And it talks about Satan and Eden, and it talks about King Tyr and Tyrus. That's another dual prophecy. And so you got lots of them in there. And another one would be Isaiah 25, the terrible ones. Another one would be Ezekiel 31 and 32. Again, with the terrible ones that are being talked about. And I've got documents on people. I mean, you really got to be into the detail to read it, but I'll walk people through it. What's the prehistory part, what's the local prophecy part, and what is the end time scenario, or nothing new is under the sun sort of principle that will show up again in the end time. What's interesting about the terrible ones, as they're talked about in Isaiah 14 and in Ezekiel and a couple other locations in the Bible, is that these are the ones in Ezekiel 32 that did terrible things while on earth, and they did terrible things to humans. These are the Rephaim kings, these are the Nephilim kings, and these are the ones that were slain. And these are the ones that are said in Ezekiel 32 as being in the prisons alongside of the abyss. These are a select number of ones that aren't wandering as bodily spirits or bodiless spirits. They're actually imprisoned alongside their procreators.
It's you got to wonder why, like they must be way worse, and yet the ones that are wandering free as demons are like pretty bad. So yeah. And we know all their traditions still go on today too. Like the people who worship Lucifer and Satan are still eating people and, doing all of these horrible things. And it's interesting. You just explained how Lucifer and Satan are actually the same name and being, but it's weird that, they're all referred to as the morning star or stars. And this is another thing from, that I've wondered. I've had people ask me, and I'm not really sure. And I feel like I've asked you before, but thank you for reminding me. Like, why do we get the morning star confusion applied to Jesus and Lucifer? And then sometimes other people, right? Aren't we all also referred to, if we're, believing in God and following God, as morning stars ourselves? Or am I getting confused?
Well, you're not confused. There's just that much confusion out there on this issue. So typically you would have Hel-El transferred into English using the Hebrew name for an angel. right? So that would be one of the names for the angel, but it is used as, it's translated as Lucifer, which is another word for, and rooted in Latin for Venus.
Yeah.
Right, which is the morning star, but it's also the twilight star, the other half of the year. So it's not always a morning star, and so that's sort of a corruption of the King James Version Bible, because it's not an English word; it's an Italian word that's inserted for a Hebrew word into English. It makes no sense.
True.
And so, what then happens by doing that? By bringing in the occult meaning of Venus as the morning star or the day star, as we get some translations in English that also come out. They say, well, the occult people will say that is the same as Jesus as being the morning star. Oh, no. That's not what it says. What it says, it says, Hail El Ben Shakar, Hail El, son of the morning, not morning star. And Jesus says, I'm the only morning star. Right? Okay. They're not the same. And we know that this is Satan that's being talked about in Isaiah 14 because he falls from heaven, right? And we know that it's Satan because Jesus, who we should all go to first for defining issues on prophecy and whatever he talked about, left us with. He said, I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning in Luke 10:8. He identifies this angel that is thrown from heaven that's also talked about in Ezekiel 28. Don't let people say that that's not Satan. That is a Rephaim. That is Satan. But Hel, the Babylon king, is a Rephaim king, and that's the allegorical derivative of Hel, right? Heylel as opposed to Helel. And you just have to sort of keep that straight and don't let them conflate that meaning.
It's so, this is why I'm so lucky I get to talk to you all the time, because it gets, it's so heavy and thick, and the multitude of, vines and thorns that have been sent out to confuse everything. And, if people asked me that question before I heard the answer you just gave, I would just say they're very clearly not the same. Satan, Lucifer, and Jesus are not even on the same ballpark. So, I mean, that's my only answer. I don't know why.
And I'll throw something else out for people to consider. You don't have Michael's name translated as the meaning of the name, and or a corruption of it. You get it clearly translated because it's a name, just as Gabriel is translated, not the meaning of it, because all of those words have meaning.
True.
And again, they're all compound words, right?
Right. Yeah, good point. So why are they playing tricks with this one? Good point.
Because people don't tend to ask good questions as to what they're saying and how they got about that. And the more you roll back, you start to see the superficial of what tends to go on out there.
And it's not even just that people don't ask good questions. People don't tend to ask questions at all. And as a teacher, I literally had to teach my high school students how to ask questions because they wouldn't, and they didn't know how. And that terrified me. And, I feel like this is where we're at, where we've just have this, a lot of tendency in our culture to support the lack in asking questions and not support asking questions.
I am a fan of asking good questions and knowing how to ask a question, because once you start to ask good questions and you do it in a way that elicits more information than less information so that you can learn more and understand more, then you'll learn to ask more of the right questions after that.
Very good point. And I ask questions and get too much information and then have to ask them again and again sometimes. But so I know we have to probably start to wind down, but I want to ask, and this has been a focus for me recently, because there's so many people who, especially with kind of the new age thing and all this stuff, and there's just a lot of people who feel like violence is never okay. It's never acceptable. Anger is never okay and never acceptable. And I wonder what you think and what you see as the Bible standing on those issues of anger and violence and whether or not they're ever acceptable.
It really is one of those great philosophical and theological questions, I think. And, and on the one hand, we have Israel that obviously had to expropriate the land from powerful demigod kind of beings, and all of the violence that went about then. And then Israel as a nation had to defend themselves. And on the flip side, you have the coming of the Messiah or Redeemer, who says, turn the other cheek. And so that's sort of the goal that we try and strive for. But in this world, if you don't push back, then evil would totally overrun things. So the Bible never talks about that you shouldn't defend yourself. But it also talks about, if you wanted to take a higher way, understand that you're not part of this world. You're not meant for this world. You're meant for the world to come. And then you'll take more of that way. So I don't think, I think it really sort of comes down to what you truly believe and what you truly think is the right thing to do. And, you know, the Bible in the New Testament even talks about it's a good thing to give your life to save another life. Right? So it has a complexity to it that I don't think it's quite as simple. I mean, if we were all like Jesus, we would never sin.
Yeah.
Right? And he let himself be crucified because he was there to take the sins away from the world and to be perfect. But we can't be perfect. But what we can do is try to have our hearts and our spirit trying to fulfill the laws, understanding that we're going to fall short. And sometimes doing the right thing becomes very, very difficult in terms of how high you want to reach for that. And so if you were in a position that somebody was about to kill one of your children or your spouse, would you not step in?
Right.
And do you think that you would lose salvation for stepping in? Probably not.
No.
If your motivation was to protect, and that's the only thing that you could do. So you have to weave through that in a situational sort of basis, understanding the two sort of aspects that we're told about in the Bible about doing nothing and when you can do something. And it's not against the law, even though we're freed from the law, but we're expected to fulfill the law through the spirit of the law, not the legal application of the law. There's nothing that says that your salvation, if you were to kill somebody in the right standpoint, that you wouldn't be saved. One would expect David is going to be saved.
Right.
Right? Maybe not, but one would expect, one would think. And so under the right circumstances, then is that, and understanding the law, it says, not kill. It doesn't say do not kill. It says do not murder. Do not kill is a mistranslation. It's to kill unjustly, which has an inference that there's a justified time to kill if you absolutely had to. And if you didn't do what Israel did, then God would have let them be destroyed, because he commanded them to fight for him and to fight for the land of the covenant so that they could be the vessel to save all humankind.
That's a very good answer. I feel like in the moment too, you could ask, God to help you understand, and that he would.
Yes.
Okay, and here's a really weird question, and then we'll end. Do you know, is God associated in any way with the eagle, or like the people of God associated with the eagle? Is the eagle a symbol that matters?
Well, we get a couple of verses in the Bible, one in Revelations, and depending on the translation that you're reading, where it says this great eagle, which is an angel that flies. So I think there's a good basis on that. And a couple other verses I won't bore people with, but there's a few instances where we get this reference to angels as eagles. And so we need to understand, I think, that part of the angelic realm there's some powerful eagle angels, just as the Anunnaki are kind of eagle-like or raven-like or bird-like, and that they would be reflective of part of the rebellious angels. So there's seemingly an order of eagle-like angels. Now, that doesn't mean God is eagle-like.
No.
That means one of the angels are. God is so far above angels, we have no ability to understand that. We can't even understand really what angels are and their full powers and what they can and can't do. So I wouldn't take it above that, but there's a case to be said that some of the angels have that sort of bird-like characteristic to it.
I ask because there's some idea where, you know, the side of good and God is represented by sort of eagles, and that the side of, you know, Satan and whatever is like snakes. And I'm sure it would never be that cut and dry completely, but I was wondering if there's any sort of evidence for that, or if it was just a random thing.
Like I say, I think when people ask me, I think there were members of every rank of angel that rebelled. And they would all be represented. And there would be a lot of angels. I mean, Daniel in Revelation says there's 10,000 times 10,000 angels, and that could be an allegory. But if you use the math of that, that would be 100 million. So by Revelation 12, you have a third of them rebelled. Whether or not they all rebelled in the beginning or some have continued to rebel, we're not sure. But by Revelation 12, we know a third. That would be 33 million. And then other verses are really sort of allegorical, that they're, you know, they can't be counted. There's so many angels, right? So I think what we know, there's probably at least 33 million and maybe even more. So there'd be a lot of angels, and that would represent from all of the ranks.
Yikes. Yeah, that's a lot of bad guys.
Yeah.
And that's not including
a lot of bad guys.
Demons too.
Yeah, we have no idea how many of those were created.
Right. Yeah, but there's more good guys, so that's all that matters. All right, well, thank you so much for your time. I want everybody to know where to go to support you and to get the book Genesis 6 Conspiracy, which you know, is it's the top book on biblical scholars or Bible scholarship. Man, you know what I mean, in my opinion. So share where people can go to get that, and how to best support you, and how they can connect with you. And I know you're so great about sharing your resources with people. Like you've mentioned a few throughout our chat that people could get from you. So how can they get that, and anything else you want to share?
Sure. So if you're interested in some of the documents I was talking about tonight, mention it by topic, number one, because I mentioned documents on pretty much every show that I do, and I won't remember which document on which show.
Right.
So mention it by topic, and I'll figure out which ones you're asking for. And you can best way to get hold of me is through my website. That's at the Genesis6conspiracy.com, Genesis 6, the number 6 conspiracy.com. And on the website, you can click on Contact the Author and ask a question, make a comment, ask for documents through there, and I will get back to you. It may take me a week to get back to you if I'm running behind schedule, but I will get back to you, and I will provide the documents. And you can also find my book on that website if you want a signed copy, or you can link over to barnesandnoble.com or amazon.com or over to the Kindle version. And it's also distributed by Bookmasters. So if you wanted to support your local bookstore, they could order it in for you from there as well. Now, a couple of things on the website is I'm hearing a little bit more that if you're not using a Google search engine in the age of high tech, my site is coming up blank. So if it comes up blank, just flip it over to the Google search engine and it'll come up.
Wow.
I've heard about that in the last month or so. And so don't get frustrated. And that's the other way to get hold of me would be on Facebook. Gary Wayne through Messenger is probably the best way, or you can post on my timeline and I'll get back to you there as well.
Perfect. Yes, you're so accessible, and it's very kind of you to share with everybody, and I really appreciate it. And then are there any final thoughts that you want to leave people with, or a little note or idea that you want people to think about? It's kind of what we were talking about before the show, is that we're in very, very
interesting times. And we don't know whether or not things are going to be pushed back again, and a little bit more of a normalcy come back, or whether or not things are picking up steam and heading towards the last 7 years. And we need to have an objective view as to where we're at today. I think we're in the fig tree generation. We don't know how long that generation is. It could be 70 years, or it could be 120 years, as Genesis 6:3 talks about. And I think if it did start, it's probably with the taking of Jerusalem, because everything in prophecy tends to center around the people of Judah having Jerusalem back. And it's going to obviously needs to be there to be able to start their sacrifices on a wing of the temple. So that has to be in place. But again, so we don't know whether we're within a few years or decades yet. So we don't want to get ahead of the chronology of what's happening against what prophecy tells us. And so we're not in the seal openings yet. We're not there. We're not in the trumpets. We're not in the bowls. We are in the birth pangs if we're in the last generation. And the birth pangs are going to increase with intensity. So that means there'll be stronger pandemics. There'll be stronger, there will get more famines that will be coming. Will there be wars and rumors of war, and there'll be stronger and more catastrophic earthquakes. And one can probably expect with all of that, probably some more weather changes as well. So I would look for that to continue. So, and that's going to continue to get stronger in the birth pangs until you get to the seal openings, which is 25% catastrophes. 25% of the population are gone, 25% of the vegetation, 25% of the world. Because if you understand what Jesus said, he talked about these birth pangs. So you have to match Revelation up with what Jesus said, and in using his chronology to keep things straight. That's why you have the trumpets follow later, which is now 33%. Mm-hmm. And then you would have you'd have 100%, except that Jesus steps in with the bowl judgments. That's the outlaying of the full understanding of the birth pangs. So I would classify where we're at today as, start of the stronger birth pangs, but as I talked about, there's 4. So as we're marching towards world government, these things are essential. Contrived or natural, and I think probably more contrived, to cattle herd people into world government and the universal religion, which will lead to the opening of the seals. And I think Babylon is coming to power before the opening of the seals. So we understand, and if we understand days as years, Revelation 2 talks about 10 days of tribulation, as opposed to the 7 years, which is the signing of the covenant. So that suggests that there's going to be severe tribulation even before the tribulation of the saints in the first 3.5 years, and then the tribulation of the whole world in the last 3.5 years. So that's the trajectory. So let's not get ahead of ourselves as to where we're at, and if you do that, you won't be deceived. Always be watching for the signs, but again, look to the clear signs that Jesus laid out for us.
Very good advice, and very well said and laid out. Thank you for that. And fellow travelers of the path, it is a beautiful thing. This has been your analog, electric, concentric dose of wisdom, according to the epic synthesizing master of biblical analysis, Gary Wayne. Gary, thank you as always for illuminating us here on Rogue Ways. We really appreciate all of your work and knowledge and wisdom.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yes, I'm happy to look forward to the next time you come back. And perfection cannot be achieved in this realm. Perfection is relegated to the unseen realm, where our flesh and blood cannot exist. Like Plato described, that is the realm of the ideal, and the ideal can only come into our realm through transference through our human lenses and abilities, and just like us, those are never ideal or perfect. What we get is always a simulacrum of the ideal. It is close and never exact, emulating and never finished. Our striving toward it always matters, however, because in our striving we envision and struggle and finally grasp on the closest level we have to the divine, which is the mental and the emotional, A truth that can only exist in the unspoken realm of imagination. And in doing so, we bring the divine as close as we can into this space here and now. So until you grapple with the ideal in the realm of the unseen and work to manifest it solidly into our world through the language of imagination, travel well, aim for balance, and always look inside first. Mwah.
Mind is elusive, time is exclusive, round trip all inclusive, the island is abusive. Jekyll's wearing hides in plain sight lines, heckle devils blind by strange slight lines. Light designed as their own resource, if they control the narrative there's no recourse. Prophecies diseased by a strong overreach, time ain't a seat that sits idly by while preach. Watching bodies wither as they slither like a sailed river on a land of which they don't own a sliver. Fatal error and avoidance, symbiosis, lack of focus. To understand balance from the rodent to the lotus, from light to the dopest, gifted through osmosis. Luminance went out a while ago, they didn't notice. Masturbating currency, squatting in the dark chamber, disconnected from Akasha, watching dissipate the vapors.
You still don't get it, do you, boys? There ain't no countries anymore. No more good guys. They're running the whole show. They own everything, the whole goddamn planet. They can do whatever they want. What's wrong with having it good for a change? Now they're gonna let us have it good if we just help them. They're gonna leave us alone. Let us make some money. You can have a little taste of that good life too. I know you want it. Hell, everybody does.
Do it to your own kind.
What's the threat? We all sell out every day. Might as well be on the winning team.